Hello and welcome back. Today I'm going to talk about the twisted serial killings of a man famously known as the Beast of Ukraine, and even more sinister, the Terminator. Between 1989 and 1990, Soviet Ukraine would meet a horror like no other. Not a natural disaster, not even war, but a terrifying nameless and faceless menace. A menace who was responsible for the violent deaths of over 52 people. A man that would have 2,000 police officers, 3,000 military forces, and all of Ukraine's radio broadcast stations on his invisible trail. This is the terrifying story of Anatoly Onoprienko. If you enjoy the content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe. I'm your host, Greenman, and this is the Murder Encyclopedia. Anatoly Onoprienko was born on the 25th of July, 1959 to Yuri Onoprienko, a decorated war veteran, and an unnamed woman in Lasky, an area located in the part of the old Soviet Union now known as Ukraine. When he was 4 years old, he lost his mother and was immediately passed off to his grandparents and aunt by his father, who had very little interest in raising him. Anatoly later confessed to feeling resentment towards his father, who abandoned him while still taking care of his older brother Valentine, who was 17 years old at the time. According to him, it was at this time that he started hearing whispers in his head, telling him about horrifically violent things. Anatoly never got to feel the full warmth of the family's love before he was sent away by his grandparents to an orphanage. Anatoly's stay at the orphanage wasn't exactly rosy either. He was bullied by older boys to the point of almost getting drowned by them. Life at the orphanage taught him that the majority of boys who were raised there would eventually end up in prison. This sentiment was ingrained deep in his mind, and he consequently thought of himself as simply a lost cause. Anatoly was sure he was bound to take the criminal path and end up in prison one way or the other. It was just a question of what kind of criminal path he was to take. Anatoly later succumbed to a life of drugs and alcohol. He performed terribly in school and would later join the army. It was in the army that he experienced the intoxicating power of using a weapon. The power play between an inanimate object that had no mind of its own save that of his master, and the great harm it could cause when unleashed greatly fascinated him. Anatoly eventually joined the Navy and was assigned to a cruise ship where he began stealing and smuggling. He gained a notorious kind of popularity and earned great respect, something he had never had. It was on the cruise ship that he met his wife Irina, and they had a son, Dmitro. Anatoly's little semblance of a sane and good life would soon come crumbling down when his criminal actions were discovered by his superiors, leading to his dismissal from the Navy. Irina divorced him and left with their son, and shortly after, Anatoly was back where he started, with nothing. It would seem that constant abandonment is something that he couldn't escape from. Alone and with everything that he had stripped away from him, Anatoly decided to start a new life. Except it wasn't exactly a new life, as he decided to do the one thing that he was good at, stealing. In late 1989, Anatoly enlisted Sergei Rogozin, his gym buddy, into a life of criminal partnership. Together, they indulged in a stream of burglaries to make illegal earnings. Their mode of operation was simple. They would scour for isolated homes located in the countryside, and then they would sneak in unnoticed and take all the valuables they wanted. These robberies, however, were about to take a much darker turn. The family of 7 in the village of Bratkavichi was about to fall prey to Anatoly's vicious machinations. That day, an unsuspecting father and mother were shot to death by Anatoly with a weapon he claimed was carried around for self-defense, much to Rogozin's bewilderment. He had, after all, naively thought that their activities were to be limited to just stealing. Anatoly went on to strangle the children, an act he confessed came out of his twisted desire to set them free from the horrors of not having parents and having to end up in an orphanage as he did. In a later statement, when asked how he felt when killing off families, he had this to say, "I just shot them. It's not that it gave me pleasure, but I felt this urge. From there on, it was almost like some game from outer space." Anatoly and his accomplice went ahead to gather all the valuables in the lifeless house and then set it ablaze. After that night, the Bratkavichi family massacre spread throughout the whole of Soviet Ukraine like wildfire. People concluded that it couldn't have been a person that committed the act. It had to be a beast. Thus the name the Beast of Ukraine was born. The following day, Rogozin took off from their criminal partnership. Little did he know that the Bratkavichi massacre was far from being Anatoly's first rodeo. It was, as a matter of fact, his 4th set of murders. Horrifyingly, Anatoly didn't limit his crimes to eliminating families in the comfort of their homes. On the 14th of June, 1989, before the Bratkavichi massacre, the Melnik family, a family of 3, had faced his violent wrath. On their way back home, they were stopped on the roadside by Anatoly. The father, who was the driver, quickly noticed that the man who had stopped them had a gun in his hand, so he tried to reach for his own gun. But Anatoly was faster and shot him dead within a matter of seconds, to the horror of his wife and son, who were also quickly shot to death. Anatoly went on to steal their valuables, then drove the car with the corpses in it to a remote place and then set them ablaze. 2 days later, he committed a similar roadside murder. This time, his victims were the Vasylyuk couple, who were also on their way back home. They were shot dead and then burnt along with their car in a similar fashion. On the 16th of August, exactly a month after the Vasylyuk couple's murder, the Podolyuk family of 5 were murdered in the same fashion. Shot, their valuables taken, and then set ablaze in their car. Before setting the car ablaze, Anatoly confessed that he sat in the car with the corpses for 2 hours without knowing what to do with them. He described their dead bodies as ugly and remarked they stink and send out bad vibes. The police were in over their heads trying to establish a pattern, a trail, something that would make them understand who was behind these murders, but they came up with nothing. And it wasn't until the Bratkevici family massacre, with no evidence whatsoever, did it dawn on them that indeed there was a beast in Ukraine. In a futile attempt to profile the so-called beast, the police only came up with one thing, that this was one man, and that one man was likely in possession of a gun that he knew how to use very well. At this point, Anatoly had earned himself a new moniker, the Terminator. From 1990 to 1995, Ukraine experienced 5 years of respite from Anatoly's wrath, but all that ended on the 5th of October 1995. That day, one Alexander Svetlotsky was selling jewelry to a woman in a car when Anatoly approached them and demanded money. He refused, and Anatoly opened fire, instantly killing the woman. As for Alexander, he would be stabbed and murdered with a hunting knife. Anatoly, in serial fashion, would steal the car, drive it to a nearby forest, and then blow it up with a gas cylinder in the trunk. The familiarity of the crime was obvious, and there was no doubt from the precise way the trail went cold that it was no copycat murder. The police instantly realized that the beast of Ukraine was back, and it was thirsting for blood. Anatoly wasn't about to let them have it easy, as more streams of murders quickly followed. As usual, most of them were family annihilations done in groups of 4s and 5s, and the body count kept rising while possible leads to catch the suspect were still at 0. His most brutal killing was the Dubček family in February 1996. After shooting the father, he raped the mother while disfiguring her with a hammer. He was met with defiance when he asked the daughter where they stashed their money, and proceeded to bludgeon her too with a hammer. Out of all of Anatoly's murders, his most bizarre occurred on the night of January 5th to the morning of January 6th, 1996. A couple, Sergei Odintsov and his girlfriend Tamara Dolinin, were attacked by Anatoly, who shot Odintsov dead. Dolinin attempted to flee but was caught by her boyfriend's killer, who stripped her, shot her in the head, and then proceeded to rape her corpse. Anatoly left their bodies in Odintsov's car trunk. However, while he was leaving the scene, he noticed a police officer, Alexander Rybalko, walking with one Sergei Garmish. Fearing that they could be witnesses, he shot them, only to then spot a soldier named Viktor Kasayev. Anatoly shot him as well, but later saw a driver, Anatoly Savitsky, whom he feared could also be a witness to the crimes he had just committed, so he shot him as well. After shooting the driver, he dragged his corpse away and stuffed it in the trunk with Odintsov and his girlfriend. He set the car on fire and murdered one more possible witness just to make sure all his bases were covered. That night alone, Anatoly murdered 7 separate individuals out of simple paranoia. The Novosad family of 4 would become Anatoly's last known victims. They were killed merely days after the police had wrongly detained and tortured to death a 26-year-old man named Yuri Mozola they thought was responsible. After this set of murders, Anatoly traveled to his cousin's place to stay for some time, fearing that law enforcement was hot on his trail. This didn't work out as planned, however, as his cousin stumbled upon Anatoly's stash of weapons. In a heated exchange between the two, Anatoly remarked, "You better watch out. When you're dead, I will be the one taking care of your children," and then left. That statement alone was enough for the cousin to make a call to the police, and that single call served as a powerful catalyst that ended the 7-year manhunt for Anatoly Onoprienko. Anatoly's arrest was sensational. 122 of the items that were missing from the houses and cars he stole from were all recovered from his abode. Amongst the items were one of his murder weapons. Anatoly confessed to over 52 of the murders. During his trial, he said that he felt like a robot driven for years by a dark force. In his delusion, he argued that he should not be tried until they determined the source of the dark force that propelled him. He felt no remorse for his crimes and made that infinitely clear to the judge by saying, "If I'm ever let out, I will start killing again, but this time it will be worse, 10 times worse. The urge is there." Anatoly was given the death penalty. However, because in 1995 Ukraine had entered the Council of Europe and as such undertook to abolish capital punishment, his sentence was commuted to life imprisonment, much to the outrage of Ukrainians who chanted in favor of his death. They would eventually get their wish much later, as Anatoly would die of a heart attack in prison in 2013. If you enjoyed watching this video, please like, share, and subscribe for more content, because we've got a lot more where this came from, here at the Murder Encyclopedia.